Okay, welcome back to Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation by Silvia Federici. We are continuing chapter 4, which is the second to last chapter. 2 years later, we're going to finish this book. And the section that I'm about to read is called The Witch Hunt and the Capitalist Rationalization of Sexuality. There's a bright light. I'm gonna go like that. So this is yeah, perfect. Okay. The witch hunt did not result in new sexual capacities or sublimated pleasures for women. Instead, it was the first step in the long march towards clean sex between clean sheets and the transformation of female sexual activity into work, a service to men, and procreation. Central to this process was the banning, as antisocial and virtually demonic, of all non-productive, non-procreative forms of female sexuality. The repulsion that non-procreative sexuality was beginning to inspire is well captured by the myth of the old witch flying on her broom, which, like the animals she also rode upon, goats, mares, dogs, was the projection of an extended penis, symbol of an unbridled lust. This imagery betrays a new sexual discipline that denied the old and ugly woman, no longer fertile, the right to a sexual life. In the creation of this stereotype, the demonologists conformed to the moral sensibility of their time, as illustrated by the words of two illustrious contemporaries of the witch hunt. To see an old lecher, what more odious, what can be more absurd, and yet so common? Worse it is in women than in men. Whilst she is an old crone, a beldam, she can neither see nor hear, a mere carcass, she caterwauls, and must have a stallion. And the other quote, yet it is even more fun to see the old women, who can scarcely carry their weight of years and look like corpses that seem to have risen from the dead. They still go around saying life is good, still in heat, looking for a mate. They are forever smearing their faces with makeup and taking tweezers to their pubic hair, exposing their sagging, withering breasts and trying to rouse failing desire with their quavery, whining voices, while they drink, dance among girls, and scribble their love letters. This was a far cry from the world of Chaucer, where the wife of Bath, after burying 5 husbands, could still openly declare, "Welcome the 6th. I don't mean to be chaste at all cost. When a spouse of mine is gone, another Christian man shall take me on." This is a woodcut. A dispute between a witch and an inquisitor. Hans Berkmeyer, before 1514. Many women accused and tried for witchcraft were old and poor. Often they depended on public charity for their survival. Witchcraft, we are told, is the weapon of the powerless. But old women were also those in the community most likely to resist the destruction of communal relations caused by the spread of capitalist relations. They were the ones who embodied the community's knowledge and memory. The witch hunt turned the image of the old woman upside down. Traditionally considered a wise woman, she became a symbol of sterility and hostility to life. So which one is the witch and which one is the inquisitor? I guess that guy's the Inquisitor. That seems accurate. But anyway, the wife of Bath. Oh my god, page. In the world of Chaucer, the sexual vitality of the old woman was an affirmation of life against death. In the iconography of the witch hunt, old age precludes in women the possibility of a sexual life, contaminates it, turns sexual activity into a tool of death rather than means of regeneration. Regardless of age but not class, in the witch trials, there is a constant identification between female sexuality and bestiality. This was suggested by copulation with the goat god, one of the representations of the devil, the infamous kiss, Sucauda, and the charge that the witches kept a variety of animals, imps or familiars, that helped them in their crimes and with whom they entertained a particularly intimate relation. These were cats, dogs, hares, frogs that the witch cared for, presumably suckling them from special teats. Other animals too played a role in the witch's life as instruments of the devil. Goats and nightmares. Oh my god, what? Mind blown. No, because it says... Wait, what the fuck is happening? No, like, look, it says... See? Well, thanks for not focusing. Focus. Oh my god. Well, it says night. It says like night in parentheses mares, meaning that like the word nightmares came from like this, like a mare that happens at night, like a fucking female horse. The witches flew her to the Sabbat. Toads provided her with a poison for her concoctions. Such was the presence of animals in the witch's world that one must presume that they too were being put on trial. The marriage between the witch and her familiars was perhaps a reference to the bestial practices that characterized the sexual life of peasants in Europe, which remained a capital offense long after the end of the witch hunt. In an era that was beginning to worship reason and to dissociate the human from the corporeal, animals too were subjected to a drastic devaluation, reduced to mere brutes, the ultimate other, perennial symbol of the worst human instincts. No crime, then, would inspire more horror than copulation with the beast, a true attack on the ontological foundations of a human nature increasingly identified with its most immaterial aspects. But the surplus of animal presences in the witches' lives also suggests that women were at a slippery crossroad between men and animals, and that not only female sexuality, but femininity as such was akin to animality. To seal this equation, witches were often accused of shifting their shape and morphing into animals, while the most commonly cited familiar was the toad, which, as a symbol of the vagina, in what way synthesized sexuality, bestiality, femininity, and evil. The witch hunt condemned female sexuality as the source of every evil, but it was also the main vehicle for a broad restructuring of sexual life that, conforming with the new capitalist work discipline, criminalized any sexual activity that threatened procreation, the transmission of property within the family, or took time and energies away from work. The witch trials provide an instructive list of the forms of sexuality that were banned as non-productive. Homosexuality, sex between young and old, sex between people of different classes, anal coitus from behind, reputedly leading to sterile relations, nudity, and dances. What? No dancing? Also proscribed was the public collective sexuality that had prevailed in the Middle Ages, as in the spring festivals of pagan origins that in the 16th century were still celebrated all over Europe. Have you guys seen Midsummer? Compare in this context the way in which P. Stubbs in Anatomy of Abuse from 1583 described the celebration of May Day in England with the standard accounts of the Sabbat, which charged that the witches always danced at these gatherings, jumping up and down at the sound of pipes and flutes, and indulged in much collective sex and merrymaking. Towards May, every parish, town, and village gets together, both men, women, and children, old and young. They run to the bushes and woods, hills and mountains, where they spend all the night in pleasant pastimes, and in the morning they return, bringing home birch boughs and branches of trees. The chiefest jewel they bring home is their maypole, which they bring home with great veneration. Then they fall to banquet and feast, to leap and dance about it, as heathen people did at the dedication of their idols. Literally, this is so relevant to the movie Midsummer. Astounding. An analogous comparison can be made between, okay, so this picture is about the execution of the Chelmsford witches in 1589. Joan Prentice, one of the victims, is shown with her familiars. R.I.P. to Joan. See the interviews. This will refuse to focus. But an analogous comparison can be made between the descriptions of the Sabbat and the descriptions which Scottish Presbyterian authorities made of pilgrimages to holy wells and other holy localities, which the Catholic Church had encouraged, but which the Presbyterians opposed as congregations of the devil and occasions for lewd affairs. As a general tendency throughout this period, any potentially transgressive meeting, peasant gathering, rebel camps, festivals, and dances was described by the authorities as a virtual Sabbat. That's that would not be fun to be alive at this time. You can't even go to a festival. It is also significant that in some areas of northern Italy, going to the Sabbat was called going to the dance or going to the game, al gioco, particularly when one considers the campaign that church and state were conducting against such pastimes. As Ginsburg points out, once we remove from the Sabbat the myths and the fantastic trappings, we discover a gathering of people accompanied by dances and sexual promiscuity. And we must add I'm sorry if there's any background noises. And we must add much eating and drinking, surely a fantasy at a time when hunger was a common experience in Europe. How revealing concerning the nature of class relations at the time of the witch hunt, that dreams of roasted mutton and ale could be frowned upon by a well-fed, beef-eating bourgeoisie as signs of a diabolical connivance. Ginsburg, however, following a well-trodden path, labels the orgies associated with the Sabbat as hallucinations of poor women to whom they serve as a recompense for a squalid existence. Here's an image about feasting an important theme in many representations of the Sabbat, a fantasy at a time when famines were a common experience in Europe. Detail from Jan Jankel's plate for Pierre de Lancre's Tableau de l'Inconstance. That looks fun. Focus on the book. In this way, he blames the victims for their demise. He also ignores that it was not the women accused of being witches, but Europe's elite, who devoted reams of paper to discussing such hallucinations, debating, for instance, the roles of succubi and incubi, or whether the witch could be impregnated by the devil, a question that apparently was still of interest for intellectuals in the 18th century. Today, these grotesque disquisitions are screened from the histories of Western civilization, or are simply forgotten, although they wove a web that condemned hundreds of thousands of women to death. Thus, the role that the witch hunt has played in the development of the bourgeois world, and specifically in the development of the capitalist discipline of sexuality, has been erased from our memory. Yet we can trace back to this process some of the main taboos of our time. This is the case with homosexuality, which in several parts of Europe was still fully accepted during the Renaissance, but was weeded out in the course of the witch hunt. So fierce was the persecution of homosexuals that its memory is still sedimented in our language. Faggot reminds us that homosexuals were, at times, the kindling for the stakes upon which witches were burned. That's crazy. While the Italian finocchio, or fennel, refers to the practice of scattering these aromatic vegetables on the stakes in order to mask the stench of burning flesh. That's so crazy. Of particular significance is the relation the witch hunt established between the prostitute and the witch, reflecting the process of devaluation which prostitution underwent in the capitalist reorganization of sexual work. As the saying went, a prostitute when young, a witch when old. Dang it. For both used sex only to deceive and corrupt men, faking a love that was only mercenary. And both sold themselves in order to obtain money and an illicit power, the witch who sold her soul to the devil being the magnified image of the prostitute who sold her body to men. Furthermore, both the old witch and the prostitute were symbols of sterility, the very personification of non-procreative sexuality. Thus, while in the Middle Ages, the prostitute and the witch were considered positive figures who performed a social service for the community, with the witch hunt both acquired the most negative connotations and were rejected as possible female identities, physically by death and socially by criminalization. For the prostitute died as a legal subject only after having died 1,000 times on the stake as a witch. Or better, the prostitute would be allowed to survive. She would even become useful, although in a clandestine fashion, only as long as the witch would be killed. For the witch was the more socially dangerous subject, the one who, in the eyes of the inquisitors, was less controllable. It was she who could give pain or pleasure, heal or harm, stir up the elements and chain the will of men. She could even cause damage solely by her look, a malocchio or evil eye, that presumably could kill. It was the sexual nature of her crimes and her lower class status that distinguished the witch from the Renaissance magician, who was largely immune from the persecution. High magic and witchcraft shared many elements. Themes derived from the learned magical tradition were introduced by the demonologists into the definition of witchcraft. Among them was the belief of Neoplatonic origin that Eros is a cosmic force, binding the universe through relations of sympathy and attraction, enabling the magician to manipulate and imitate nature in his experiments. A similar power was attributed to the witch, who reputedly could raise storms by mimetically stirring a puddle, or could exercise an attraction similar to the bonding of metals in the alchemic tradition. The ideology of witchcraft also reflected the biblical tenet, common to both magic and alchemy, that stipulates a connection between sexuality and knowledge. The thesis that witches acquired their powers by copulating with the devil echoed the alchemic belief that women had appropriated the secrets of chemistry by copulating with rebel demons. High magic, however, was not persecuted, though alchemy was increasingly frowned upon, as it appeared an idle pursuit and as such a waste of time and resources. The magicians were an elite who often serviced princes and other highly positioned people, and the demonologists carefully distinguished between them and the witches by including high magic, particularly astrology and astronomy, in the range of the sciences. Here's a woodcut from the next part. A 16th century representation of Caribbean Indians as devils from Tobias George Smollett. And the title that he gave it was, from his book, A Compendium of Authentic and Entertaining Voyages, digested in a chronological series. And I'm gonna drink water at the same time. Pretty fucked up, if you ask me. The Witch Hunt and the New World. The counterparts of the typical European witch, then, are not the Renaissance magicians, but, okay, this is where she gets into the Caliban part. Okay, hold on, I'll tell you everybody, here we go. The counterparts of the typical European witch, then, were not the Renaissance magicians, but the colonized Native Americans and the enslaved Africans, who, in the plantations of the New World, shared a destiny similar to that of women in Europe, providing for capital the seemingly limitless supply of labor necessary for accumulation. So connected were the destinies of women in Europe and those of American Indians and Africans in the colonies that their influences were reciprocal. Witch hunting and charges of devil worshipping were brought to the Americas to break the resistance of the local populations, justifying colonization and the slave trade in the eyes of the world. In turn, according to Luciano Paranetto, it was the American experience that persuaded the European authorities to believe in the existence of entire populations of witches, and instigated them to apply in Europe the same techniques of mass extermination developed in America. In Mexico, from 1536 to 1543, the Bishop Zumarraga conducted 19 trials involving 75 Indian heretics, mainly drawn from the political and religious leaders of central Mexican communities, a number of whom ended their lives at the stake. The Friar Diego de Landa led idolatry trials in the Yucatan during the 1560s, in which torture, whippings, and auto de fe figured prominently. Witch hunts were conducted also in Peru to destroy the cult of the local gods, considered demons by the Europeans. Everywhere, the Spaniards saw the face of the devil in the foods and the primitive vices of the Indians in their barbaric languages. That's a quote from De Leon. In the colonies, too, it was women who were more vulnerable to being accused of being witches, for being held in special contempt by the Europeans as weak-minded females. They soon became the staunchest defenders of their communities. The common fate of Europe's witches and Europe's colonial subjects is further demonstrated by the growing exchange in the course of the 17th century between the ideology of witchcraft and the racist ideology that developed on the soil of the conquest and the slave trade. The devil was portrayed as a black man, and black people were increasingly treated like devils, so that devil worship and diabolical interventions became the most widely reported aspect of the non-European societies that slave traders encountered. From Laps to Samoyed to the Hottentots and Indonesians, there was no society, Anthony Barker writes, which was not labeled by some Englishman as actively under diabolical influence. Just as in Europe, the trademark of diabolism was an abnormal lust and sexual potency. The devil was often portrayed as possessing two penises, while tales of brutish sexual practices and inordinate fondness for music and dancing became staples in the reports of missionaries and travelers to the New World. According to historian Brian Easley, this systematic exaggeration of black sexual potency betrays the anxiety that white men of property felt toward their own sexuality. Presumably, white upper-class males feared the competition of the people they enslaved, whom they saw as closer to nature because they felt sexually inadequate due to excessive doses of self-control and prudential reasoning. What? But the over-sexualization of women and black men, the witches and the devils, must also be rooted in the position which they occupied in the international division of labor that was emerging on the basis of the colonization of America. The slave trade and the witch hunt. For the definition of blackness and femaleness as marks of bestiality and irrationality conformed with the exclusion of women in Europe and women and men in the colonies from the social contract implicit in the wage and the consequent naturalization of their exploitation. The next section is called The Witch, the Healer, and the Birth of Modern Science. Other motives operated behind the persecution of witches. Charges of witchcraft often served to punish the attack on property, primarily thefts, which increased dramatically in the 16th and 17th centuries, following the increasing privatization of land and agriculture. As we have seen in England, poor women who begged for or stole milk or wine from the houses of their neighbors or were on public assistance were likely to be suspected of practicing evil arts. Alan McFarlane and Keith Thomas have shown that in this period there was a marked deterioration in the condition of old women following the loss of the commons and the reorganization of family life, which gave priority to child raising at the expense of the care previously provided to the elderly. These elders were now forced to rely on their friends or neighbors for their survival, or joined the poor rolls. At the very time when the new Protestant ethic was beginning to finger almsgiving as a waste and an encouragement to sloth, and as the institutions that in the past had catered to the poor were breaking down. Some poor women presumably used the fear that their bad reputation as witches inspired to obtain what they needed, but it was not just the bad witch who cursed and allegedly lamed cattle, ruined crops, or caused her employer's children to die that was condemned. The good witch, who made sorcery her career, was also punished, often more severely. Historically, the witch was the village midwife, medic, soothsayer, or sorceress, whose privileged area of competence, as Burckhardt wrote concerning the Italian witches, was amorous intrigue. An urban embodiment of this type of witch was the Celestina in the play by Fernando de Rojas, The Celestina, from 1499. Of her it was said that she had 6 trades, to wit, laundress, perfumer, a master hand at making cosmetics and replacing damaged maidenheads, procuress, and something of a witch. Her first trade was a cover for the rest, and with this excuse many servant girls went to her house to do their washing. You can't imagine the traffic she carried on. She was a baby doctor. She picked up flax in one house and brought it to another, all this as an excuse to get in everywhere. One would say, "Mother, come here," or "Here comes the mistress." Everyone knew her, and yet in spite of her many duties, she found time to go to Mass or Vesper. A more typical healer, however, was Costanza, a woman tried as a witch in San Miniato, a small town of Toscana, in 1594. After becoming a widow, Costanza had set herself up as a professional healer, soon becoming well known in the region for her therapeutic remedies and exorcisms. She lived with her niece and 2 other women, widows as well. A next-door neighbor, also a widow, gave her the spices for her drugs. She received her clients in her home, but she also traveled wherever she was needed to mark an animal, visit a sick person, help people carry out a revenge, or free themselves from the effects of medical charms. Her tools were natural oils and powders, as well as devices apt to cure and protect by sympathy or contact. It was not in her interest to inspire fear in her community, as practicing her arts was her way of making a living. She was in fact very popular. Everyone would go to her to be cured, to have his or her fortune told, to find missing objects, or to buy love potions. But she did not escape persecution. After the Council of Trento, the Counter-Reformation took a strong position against popular healers, fearing their power and deep roots in the culture of their communities. In England as well, the fate of the good witches was sealed in 1604, when a statute passed by James I established the death penalty for anyone who used spirits and magic, even if they caused no visible harm. With the persecution of the folk healer, women were expropriated from a patrimony of empirical knowledge regarding herbs and healing remedies that they had accumulated and transmitted from generation to generation, its loss paving the way for a new form of enclosure. This was the rise of professional medicine, which erected in front of the lower classes a wall of unchallengeable scientific knowledge, unaffordable and alien, despite its curative pretenses. The displacement of the folk healer witch by the doctor raises the question of the role that the development of modern science and the scientific worldview played in the rise and fall of the witch hunt. On this question, we have 2 opposite viewpoints. On one side, we have the theory descending from the Enlightenment, which credits the advent of scientific rationalism as the key factor in the termination of the persecution. As formulated by Joseph Klatz in 1985, this theory argues that the new science transformed intellectual life, generating a new skepticism as it revealed the universe as a self-regulating mechanism in which direct and constant divine intervention was unnecessary. However, Klatz admits that the same judges who by the 1650s were putting a brake on witch trials never questioned the reality of witchcraft. Neither in France nor anywhere else do the 17th century judges who put an end to witch hunting profess that there were no witches. Like Newton and other scientists of the time, judges continued to accept supernatural magic as theoretically plausible. Here's a woodcut, The Witch's Herbery, engraved by Hans Weiditz, 1532. As the starry globe suggests, the virtue of the herbs was strengthened by the proper astral conjunction. That's hot. Indeed, there is no evidence that the new science had a liberating effect. mechanist view of nature that came into existence with the rise of modern science disenchanted the world. But there is no evidence that those who promoted it ever spoke in defense of the women accused as witches. Descartes declared himself an agnostic on this matter. Other mechanical philosophers, like Joseph Glanville and Thomas Hobbes, strongly supported the witch hunt. What ended the witch hunt, as Brian Easley has convincingly shown, was the annihilation of the world of the witches and the imposition of the social discipline that the victorious capitalist system required. In other words, the witch hunt came to an end by the late 17th century because the ruling class by this time enjoyed a growing sense of security concerning its power, not because a more enlightened view of the world had emerged. The question that remains is whether the rise of the modern scientific method can be considered the cause of the witch hunt. This view has been argued most forcefully by Carolyn Merchant in The Death of Nature, 1980, which roots the persecution of the witches in the paradigm shift the scientific revolution, and particularly the rise of Cartesian mechanistic philosophy, provoked. According to Merchant, this shift replaced an organic worldview that had looked at nature, women, and the earth as nurturing mothers with a mechanical one that degraded them to the rank of standing resources. Removing any ethical constraints to their exploitation. The woman as witch, Merchant argues, was persecuted as the embodiment of the wild side of nature, of all that in nature seemed disorderly, uncontrollable, and thus antagonistic to the project undertaken by the new science. Merchant finds a proof of the connection between the persecution of the witches and the rise of modern science in the work of Francis Bacon, one of the reputed fathers of the new scientific method, showing that his concept of the scientific investigation of nature was modeled on the interrogation of the witches under torture, portraying nature as a woman to be conquered, unveiled, and raped. Merchant's account has the great merit of challenging the assumption that scientific rationalism was a vehicle of progress, and focuses our attention on the profound alienation that modern science has instituted between human beings and nature. It also links the witch hunt to the destruction of the environment and connects the capitalist exploitation of the natural world with the exploitation of women. I gotta read that. The Death of Nature, Carolyn Merchant, 1980. Let's fold the page. Merchant, however, overlooks the fact that the organic worldview, which the elites embraced in pre-scientific Europe, left room for slavery and the extermination of the heretics. We also know that the aspiration to the technological domination of nature and the appropriation of women's creative powers has accommodated different cosmological frameworks. The Renaissance magicians were no less interested in these objectives, while Newtonian physics owed its discovery of gravitational attraction not to a mechanistic but to a magical view of nature. Furthermore, when the vogue for philosophical mechanism had run its course, by the beginning of the 18th century, new philosophical trends emerged that stressed the value of sympathy, sensibility, and passion, and yet were easily integrated into the project of the new science. We should also consider that the intellectual scaffold that supported the persecution of the witches was not directly taken from the pages of philosophical rationalism. Rather, it was a transitional phenomenon, a sort of ideological bricolage that evolved under the pressure of the task it had to accomplish. Within it, elements taken from the fantastical world of medieval Christianity, rationalistic arguments, and modern bureaucratic court procedures combined, in the same way as, in the forging of Nazism, the cult of science and technology combined with a scenario pretending to restore an archaic mythical world of blood bonds and pre-monetary allegiances. This point is suggested by Parinetto, who observes that the witch hunt was a classical instance, unfortunately not the last, of how in the history of capitalism, going back was a means of stepping forward from the viewpoint of establishing the conditions for capital accumulation. For in conjuring the devil, the inquisitors disposed of popular animism and pantheism, redefining in a more centralized fashion the location and distribution of power in the cosmos and society. Thus, paradoxically, Parinetto writes, in the witch hunt, the devil functioned as the true servant of God. He was the operator that most contributed to paving the way to the new science. Like a bailiff or God's secret agent, the devil brought order into the world, emptying it from competing influences and reasserting God as the exclusive ruler. He so well consolidated God's command over human affairs that within a century, with the advent of Newtonian physics, God would be able to retire from the world, content to guard its clock-like operations from afar. Rationalism and mechanism, then, were not the immediate cause of the persecutions, although they contributed to create a world committed to the exploitation of nature. More important in instigating the witch hunt was the need of the European elites to eradicate an entire mode of existence which by the late Middle Ages was threatening their political and economic power. Is this going to be in landscape or portrait? When this task was accomplished, when social discipline was restored and the ruling class saw its hegemony consolidated, witch trials came to an end. The belief in witchcraft could even become an object of ridicule, decried as a superstition, and soon put out of memory. This process began throughout Europe toward the end of the 17th century, though witch trials continued in Scotland for 3 more decades. A factor contributing to the end of the witch hunt was the fact that the ruling class was beginning to lose control over it, coming under the fire of its own repressive machine, with denunciations targeting even its own members. Middlefort writes that in Germany, as the flames licked closer to the names of people who enjoyed high rank and power, the judges lost confidence in the confessions and the panic ceased. The alchemist's desire to appropriate the function of maternity is well reflected in this picture of Hermes Trismegistus, alchemy's mythical founder, holding a fetus in his womb and suggesting the inseminating role of the male. They're so jealous. They have uterus envy. See that baby in there? That's crazy. In France, too, the final wave of trials brought widespread social disorder. Servants accused their masters, children accused their parents, husbands accused their wives. Under these circumstances, the king decided to intervene, and Colbert extended Paris's jurisdiction to the whole of France to end the persecution. A new legal code was promulgated in which witchcraft was not even mentioned. Just as the state had started the witch hunt, so too, one by one, various governments took the initiative in ending it. From the mid-17th century on, efforts were made to break judicial and inquisitorial zeal. One immediate consequence was that in the 18th century, common crime suddenly multiplied. In England between 1686 and 1712, as the witch hunt died down, arrests for damage to property, burning of granaries, houses, and haystacks in particular, and assaults rose enormously, while new crimes entered the statute books. Blasphemy began to be treated as a punishable offense. In France, it was decreed that after the sixth conviction, the blasphemers would have their tongue cut out. And so was sacrilege, the profanation of relics, and the theft of hosts. New limits were also put on the sale of poisons. Their private use was forbidden, their sale was made conditional upon the acquisition of a license, and the death penalty was extended to poisoners. All this suggests that the new social order was by now sufficiently consolidated for crimes to be identified and punished as such, without any recourse to the supernatural. In the words of a French parliamentarian, witches and sorcerers are no longer condemned, firstly, because it is difficult to establish proof of witchcraft, and secondly, because such condemnations have been used to do harm. One has ceased, therefore, to accuse them of the uncertain in order to accuse them of the certain. Once the subversive potential of witchcraft was destroyed, the practice of magic could even be allowed to continue. After the witch hunt came to an end, many women continued to support themselves by foretelling the future, selling charms, and practicing other forms of magic. As Pierre Bayle reported in 1704, in many provinces of France, in Savoy, in the canton of Bern, and many other places in Europe, there is no village or hamlet, no matter how small, where someone is not considered a witch. In 18th century France, an interest for witchcraft developed also among the urban nobility, who, being excluded from economic production and sensing that their privileges were coming under attack, satisfied their desire for power by recourse to the magical arts. But now the authorities were no longer interested in prosecuting these practices, being inclined instead to view witchcraft as a product of ignorance or a disorder of the imagination. By the 18th century, the European intelligentsia even began to take pride in its acquired enlightenment, and confidently proceeded to rewrite the history of the witch hunt, dismissing it as a product of medieval superstition. Yet the specter of the witches continued to haunt the imagination of the ruling class. In 1871, the Parisian bourgeoisie instinctively returned to it, to demonize the female communards, accusing them of wanting to set Paris aflame. There can be little doubt, in fact, that the models for the lurid tales and images used by the bourgeois press to create the myth of the Petrolus were drawn from the repertoire of the witch hunt. As described by Edith Thomas, the enemies of the Commune claimed that thousands of proletarian women roamed like witches the city day and night with pots full of kerosene and stickers with the notation BPB, bon pour brûler, good for torching, presumably following instructions given to them as part of a great conspiracy to reduce Paris to ashes in front of the troops advancing from Versailles. Thomas writes that pétrolus were to be found everywhere. In the areas occupied by the Versailles army, it was enough that a woman be poor and ill-dressed, and that she'd be carrying a basket, box, or milk bottle to be suspected. Hundreds of women were thus summarily executed, while the press vilified them in the papers. Like the witch, the Petrolus was depicted as an older woman with a wild, savage look and uncombed hair. In her hands was the container for the liquid she used to perpetrate her crimes. Okay, above Petrolus, color lithograph by Bertrand reproduced in Le Commune. Le Commune. Le Commune. She got that Molotov on her. Ready to throw that thing wherever it needs to go. The Woman of Paris. Wood engraving reproduced in the graphic. Ready to fight. That's the end of chapter 4, and we literally only have one chapter left. My good viewers, thank you so much for following along on this journey. It's taken a while. I'm really excited to finally complete it. The next chapter is called Colonization and Christianization, Caliban Witches in the New World. And I'm really excited to see what it's all about. Thank you so much for viewing. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I also make ASMR. Feel free to check that out as well. Next, I'm thinking about reading. I'm super interested in this book, Male Fantasies by Klaus the Wellite. If you guys have any thoughts, let me know. If that sounds like the kind of thing that you think you would be interested in, feel free to make suggestions as well. Thank you so much. Have a great day and day. Bye.